Hey, good morning, everybody. The second speaker from Austin, so in a row. So I'm going to try to keep it weird. You know, we have to keep up our motto there. My talk today is called "We Are the Asteroid," and I have a special announcement that Cyndi Lauper is going to come in and sing "We Are the Asteroid" to the tune of "We Are the World." No, but maybe. Someone call her and see if she can come in. But we're looking at political systems design for the Anthropocene, and I'll explain what that is. Sandy talked about constitutional design, which is potentially part of political systems design. I also want you to think about how would you design political systems that aren't written down in a constitution, and to expand the possibilities of thinking about systems design in that way, beyond a written constitution, although I'll take that. I'll take a new design of that already. So one of the motivating sort of quotes or mottos or ways of thinking about what I do, and I think hopefully will convince you or persuade you to think about what you're doing as well, is a quote from Bucky Fuller. He says, "We are called to be architects of the future, not its victims." So as Nathan mentioned, in my line of work, I don't say that we can predict the future, and there's not a single future. I would put a little S on that potentially. But that we are capable of acting on the future in some direct way, that we have built the world, in many cases, the world that we live in now, intentionally or unintentionally by designing in a certain way, but we can redesign or re-architect what's to come. And we have that, not only that possibility, but that mandate, the responsibility to do it as well. Now, we know there are existential threats to humanity, to our lives, things from inside and things from the outside. What's really interesting about our time now is that we potentially have, for the first time in human history, the capacity to thwart something like a major asteroid that will destroy life on the planet. NASA is using crowdsourcing techniques to have people look for near-Earth objects, to try to see if they're coming, when they're coming, and then if they're going to hit Earth, if they're big enough to do something about it. That's an amazing capacity that we have that exists right now. But, you know, that's nice. But what if we are the asteroid? Those external threats are one thing. But what about the 7+ billion near-Earth objects that are running around screwing up the planet now? What do we do about that? How do we design systems to account for those kinds of things? You know, I mean, we are a major geological force, and this is where the Anthropocene concept comes from. We are moving, as the geologist Bruce Wilkinson says, we're moving more sediment now than all the other geological processes on Earth. We are a major geological force on this planet. And we're continuing to do that. We're pumping, pulling carbon out of the ground, burning it, putting it into the atmosphere. We're changing the planet in ways that will show up, you know, if you buy the argument of the Anthropocene, it'll show up on the geological record. In a million years, you will be able to see this blip because humans have had such a major impact on the planet. So we need to design for that. We need to account for that. We need to understand that this is the world that we live in. I love this one. This is just like you're sucking water and turning it into a city. You know, so we're doing this incredible, you know, feats of progress and growth, but at what cost? And can we handle it? Are we able to manage this? So we know maybe we're screwing this up. This is geologic, but also political and social. There's massive inequality. There's social unrest. There's injustice in the world. So we're messing up the planet. We're not doing that great for people if you look at it in certain ways. I mean, there are a lot of things that are getting better. Another one of my favorite quotes is from Tom Attlee. He says, "Things are getting better and better and worse, faster and faster." And that's what it feels like sometimes, right? I can show you metrics about lower mortality rates and there's less violence on the planet, but also we know that we're messing things up and maybe we're in a stage where, yeah, it could be okay for now, but it's going to get really, really bad later on. So this is our reality. This is what, you know, the first message I want to convey to you is this is what kind of universe we're living in. This is the Anthropocene. We are planet eaters and maybe planet creators, but we have to take responsibility for doing something about it. And as Sandy Pentland talks about, he says, you know, the biggest problem is not necessarily global warming or framing it like that or war. It's really that we don't know how to manage ourselves. But as I mentioned with the asteroid example, we have amazing new tools that we're creating. This is a map of transportation going on in London. We can look at data, we can see how people are acting. We don't have to infer as much as we used to about why people make decisions. We can look at what they're actually doing, connect the dots, look at patterns that are ongoing. This is the 10,000-foot view. We can manage that way. But I also want to remind us that we are human beings, and that 10,000-foot view of transportation is one way of looking at it. We also got to remember that there were people in those cars and subways, and I love this. Just a very visceral example that what does it feel like on the ground? We have to account for both sides of that. If we're going to design, you can't just design at an abstract 10,000-foot level. You have to design for those people being squeezed into that subway car. They get them all in. There you go. So thinking about scale and the human part of that as well, and understanding that big data is about those individuals being squeezed in the car as well. So my colleagues at the Institute for the Future created this wonderful map. It's publicly available. You should check it out. Called A Planet of Civic Laboratories. And I love that framing, because that's I think what we need. We need a sense of political experimentation. I mean, Sandy was calling it out as well. We're scared of doing that, sort of at a federal level, but there are many, many examples of cities, communities, groups, houses, regions trying to test out new ways of governing and trying to find better outcomes. So we're living, in a sense, a planet of civic laboratories. I think we're at a renaissance point in political systems design. I think we're going to see some radical new things in it. It needs people like Sandy, constitutional law professors. It needs designers. It needs artists. It needs hackers. It needs computer scientists, futurists. It needs all of us in a way, and that's another message I'll keep coming back to. But civic labs, we don't want to be full of lab rats, right? We don't want to be experimented on. We need to find platforms of participation, structures of participation that allow people to be engaged in this design process. It can't be, in my view, it's not going to work as well if it's just sort of hoisted on to a society, or that, the Facebook example of emotion manipulation. We don't want to be manipulated. We don't want to have our governments pushing us in ways that we don't have a say in how that occurs. I think we would all be open to running experiments, trying out new ideas, maybe, most of us, I hope. But how is that going to be designed? Who's going to do that? Who's designing it? Who's participating in it? What are the feedback mechanisms? All of these things. So, you wake up one morning and you're getting this dashboard of how you are as a citizen. That's great information and great feedback. Where do you play as an individual in that system? So again, just coming back to some of these core messages, this was my advisor at the University of Hawaii, Jim Dater, and I love this. This is such a freeing quote, mantra to me. Society is a social invention, and you are social inventors. We created, again, intentionally or not, some, not all, but the world was an invention, the way it's designed now in many ways, and that we are called to be social inventors. So that's the challenge. So who's going to invent the next society? Is it 55 rich white dudes in Philadelphia, as our Constitution was created? I doubt it. What's going to be is 1,000 white dudes on the internet. No, we don't want that either. We want millions, thousands, millions, potentially billions of people around the world to contribute in some useful way. So the challenge is, how do you design structures of participation that allow people to input, whether it's small or large, whether it's a whole new constitution or whether it's just one idea or one question that feeds back into the system. So designing those structures, designing new participatory systems, I think, is where we'll end up making progress. And another great quote from Lawrence Lessig: "Politics is the one sport where the amateur is better for the nation than the professional." So we all have something to say. I mean, our politicians are basically bought off now. We know that. Lessig talks about corruption in the system, and in many ways, that's the situation we're dealing with. Do we try to change that, the noble effort to pull out corruption of our system, or can we find another way around that as well? Get more people involved instead of the very, very tiny few that we have representing us now, in the U.S. at least. So if we need to redesign our systems of governance, if we agree that that's a need, how do you do it? And that was the question driving us at the Governance Futures Lab at the Institute for the Future, based in many ways on Jim Dater's work at the University of Hawaii. He's retired this year, but I think it was the only class in political systems design offered in a university, as far as I know, that he taught for about 40 years. So what we did was take the core of that course and modularize it in a way so that people could, if you had these are cards, sort of one-by-one step cards to take, and run through a governance design process. So we agree that we need to do something. How do we do it? And this is one offer, one attempt to try to help with that question. It's certainly not the only one, and it may not end up being the best one, but it's something. And I've run this now many times. I'll talk about the first example that we did with it, but I've done it a few dozen times now, and I think it really helps to give some structure to your thinking about how to go about redesigning government, such a giant task that you would take upon yourself. So where do we start? And I'm going to kind of go through these relatively quickly. Diagnosing the problem. I think we know these pretty well. Sandy mentioned many of them. What are the major complaints about government? How does it fail? Let's think about those. So things like it's bureaucratic. We know that in many ways it puts the system of governance, the process above the actual people, those who are governed. It tends to be nationalistic. The nation state, may be too large for local problems. It may be too small for global problems. And the sovereignty issues may thwart a more globalist kind of approach to solving problems. And then all the other issues with nationalism, the psychology of it is an issue as well. So thinking about nationalism, patriarchy, obviously, we have a society that has tended to favor males over females systematically. How do we address that complaint? Undemocratic, favoring participation of some at the expense of others. I don't think the U.S. is a democracy, even though we talk about it. How do we, if that's one of our values, how do we design that into the system? How do we deal with that complaint? Governments have a monopoly on violence, and they use it. That has, that was a design. All of these things were design solutions to problems. So instead of every man and woman for himself, in sort of Wild West justice, well, we'll allow the only legitimate justice to be held by governments. And so that way everyone can be protected, right? That was the design attempt, the challenge to solve. We know that has been abused multiple times throughout history. And for me, unfuturistic. So I have this picture of North Carolina here because they've passed a law that you can't talk about climate change and sea level rise if you're selling real estate. So we're actively, in many ways, pushing against the future. And there's systemic issues, structural issues in governance as well. The election cycles, 2 or 4, 6-year cycles, it's very difficult. The incentives are all pushing towards short-term returns. If I have an idea, a plan that is going to take 20 years to implement, and there's going to be pain and suffering in the next 4 years, if I'm an elected official, I'm not going to get elected if I'm causing that kind of pain and suffering in the short term, trying to help the long term. So the incentive structures, the election cycles, those things are structural issues that tend to reward short-term thinking. Not always, but it can be overcome, but it's difficult sometimes. Okay, so understanding the problems. Then you begin to choose your design parameters. And this is where I think where this kind of process distinguishes itself from other ways that people approach policy design or civic innovation, which often tends to not address your core assumptions about how government works, what's going on. Often it's add a piece of technology, a new app or a new platform into a system and stir and see what happens. This process forces you to examine your own assumptions systematically, step by step, going through what are we actually building. This would create a design brief once you go through each one of these things. So again, I'm going to go through these just to name them more than really explain them in great detail, but choosing a unit of analysis. Right now, our unit of analysis in the US tends to be an individual. So most of our rights and responsibilities and voting and all of that is tied to an individual, but historically that hasn't always been the case. We could design a system for a family. We could design it for a community. We could design it for a species, a culture. Geographical boundaries could be another way of doing it. Up and down. We could design a political system for selfish genes, for example. You can think about any way you want to do it, but that decision will really change the kind of design that would come out of at the end. Okay, unit of analysis, then your cosmology. We often, almost never think about this. The US Constitution was based on Newtonian physics. It's mechanistic, it's push and pull, it's balance of power against power. So this is a very Newtonian worldview that was embedded in the US Constitution. But what if we had a quantum universe with sort of randomness and mutual entailment and entanglement between individuals, and we don't have an atomistic bounded individual as our unit of analysis? What would a political system look like if we started with that assumption as opposed to a mechanistic assumption? Another big one, human nature. So again, just to refer back to the US Constitution, we tend to have a system based on the fact that, sort of Adam Smith, humans are rational and greedy, a little bit of biblical fall from grace, that people are kind of naturally evil and need some help. That was how our system was designed, to balance greed against greed in order for the system itself to come out. But what if we designed thinking that humans are irrational and empathetic and compassionate? What kind of system comes out of that core assumption as opposed to greedy and rational? Express your values. What are you talking about? What do you want to see your world exist in your system? Do you want liberty, freedom, security, harmony? Expressing your values explicitly is really important. And also, just as important, is saying how these are going to be expressed behaviorally. So if I say equality is one of my values, well, am I going to design a system like Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron, where everyone is sort of balanced out, and if you're strong, you're weighted down with heavy weights, and if you're smart, your brain is disrupted by noises every few minutes? Is that how the outcome of equality is going to look like? So thinking through that as well, and understanding what is not only the values, but how you're going to express them in actual behavior. And then you begin your design process after that. So again, those first two parts are kind of giving you a brief, and then you begin the design process with those parameters, being honest to those parameters, and try to design a system as you can. So I want to give an example of how we did this. We ran this process through at the Institute for the Future last year in something we call the Reconstitutional Convention. We had 60 or so people in the audience in Palo Alto at the time. We ran nodes around 9 other places around the world, as weird and diverse as Myanmar and Birmingham, Alabama, Singapore, Washington, D.C., all over the world. So we had these satellite nodes who took basically the design briefs that were created in Palo Alto on day 1, and day 2 all over the world they created new designs out of that. So one of my favorite outcomes of this process that we did in Palo Alto was we asked our groups to create new preambles, and thinking about these, in sort of business context, 21st century mission statements. That's what a preamble is in a way. So the preamble to the US Constitution, as you look at it again, it's basically giving you the mission. What do you want? What are we trying to do with this document, with this system that they had created at the time? So I wanted to give some examples of a couple of really interesting preambles that came out of the Reconstitutional Convention. And we've talked about trust a bunch of times. Jerry Michalski was actually part of this group in Palo Alto, and so you'll see some highly resonating ideas coming out of this. But just looking at this, and just think about this as if you had to design a system where this was your preamble, this is kind of the rules of your universe that you needed to follow, what would you design? So let's look at it for a second. So blending the topics of trust and inclusivity, we believe that scarcity equals abundance minus trust. The world is unpredictable. We must remember the importance of interdependency. We must go back to minding the commons, not mining them. The key is to start building systems out of trust. We believe that trust by default means since humans are generally good. Okay, so that's their assumption there. Everyone should plant the seed and nurture the plant, so we all share in the fruits of our labor. So we know how much this currency of trust, how important it is. So imagine building a system where that is your opening argument, your mission statement. Another group that I found really interesting was a group around public imagination, so that taking the assumption that we don't really have a shared public imagination. And so their mission statement, I'll read this really quickly. So any democracy requires a thriving public imagination in order to make visible, shareable, and understandable to all the people new ideas, new models, new potential policies. We cannot make any kind of collective decision unless the collective can understand what is at stake and envision where it may lead. We call for a creation of a platform to stimulate and facilitate public imagination about the future, a platform that can inform, influence, and inspire governments at all scales, from the city to the state to the nation state to a union to a global governing body. So just, the words that I highlighted, just think about those as guiding points. So in the spirit of design, political system design thinking, I'm making two proposals today. They're a little bit outlandish and a little bit ridiculous, and I'm not going to force myself to tell you how we get from here to there. I'm just going to throw them out there, and these are sort of provocations, but something to think through. How might we redesign the system ourselves? Okay, so the first one is called Civic Imagination Day. So this is basically around the assumption that our votes don't really matter. And I couldn't find the source of this quote, but I love this. So a petition is just a list of people who don't have money. You can't have an effect on the political system at all. Voting is similarly, I would argue, at an individual level, similarly ineffective. It may make us feel good, aggregating, yes, but as an individual, you have a better chance of being elected president than your vote actually determining election as an individual. So, taking those assumptions and just running with it in a different direction. So we have, in the 2012 election, we had 222 million eligible voters. The average wait time was 13 minutes. So my proposal is to, instead of everyone, and not every one of those 222 million voted, but taking a random sample of 1% of those 222 million, roughly 2 million, and that the other 99%, 220 million people are required to spend that 13 minutes that on average that they would be waiting. Again, this is averages, not every person waits that long, of course, but take that 13 minutes and do something civic. Either go have a conversation with someone, call in to a hotline and complain about the government, do street art, create a new system, do something that's civic oriented. And when you do the numbers and math here, this is what gets exciting, that you would have over 2.9 billion minutes of civic engagement instead of wasting your time. Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to go for it. Wasting your time voting down at the voting booth. 47 million hours of civic engagement. What would happen if we spent Election Day doing that as a Civic Imagination Day? Okay. The second one is a reorientation of corporate personhood. Now, I'm not in favor of corporations as people, but I'm sort of giving up on the fact that we can stop that from happening for now, although I'll fight it another day. So this proposal is to modify that corporate personhood in different ways, really treat them as people. I have some images here from an experiential future that we created in Hawaii a few years ago that had posited a debate between two candidates for governor of Hawaii. Those two candidates happened to be corporations. So in this future, corporate personhood allowed corporations as people to actually run for office. So that was, again, a bit of a provocation. Kobayashi was a gaming and design firm that they actually combined all of the best of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, all the best. They had an algorithm that they created from the best leaders in history. They put them all together, and that was going to be who ran the state in that case. So anyway, I've been thinking about this for a while. So the idea here for this one is to, again, another great quote to kick it off. So, and I don't have the source here. I believe corporations are people when Texas executes one of them. Okay, so my proposal, just a slight modification. Yes, you can be people, but you're not going to be fully adult people until you're 18. So this is why I have Facebook here, only a few years old. Facebook would just be in its sort of adolescence, early adolescence maybe, or tweens, whatever it is. But you're not allowed to have full personhood rights just when you sign your corporate articles. You have to actually wait a while. And on the back end, it is tied to the oldest living human, so roughly 120 years old. So after 120 years, you're also not a person anymore. You can be a business, you can still run your business, but you're not allowed all of those rights that come along with being a person. Okay, so going back to our friend here, things are fucked up and bullshit. What do we do about it? At the ReconCon, I asked Twitter to help me come up with the opposite of what shit is fucked up and bullshit is. And a friend of mine, Chris Arkenberg, had the perfect response. So the diametric opposite of shit is fucked up and bullshit is, it's like a koala crapped a rainbow in my brain. So I would encourage you to try to design a system where koalas are crapping rainbows in your brain and see what happens. So we may come up with our own version of utopia as we paste it over this system that we've inherited. And we'll do our best to do that. So thank you very much.